Everybody, great to see you. Great to see the sunshine's back out today. I met some of you in the parking lot. It's like, I haven't squinted in 3 weeks. It's crazy. So great to see you and good to have you with us. We are starting a new series. I'm excited about this series for the next few weeks here in the fall. For the next several weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the stories from the life of Daniel. Daniel is, it's a book of the Bible. The book of Daniel, you find it in the Old Testament. Towards the end of the Old Testament, it's in with the prophets. In fact, Daniel is the last of 5 books that we call the major prophets. You got the major prophets and the minor prophets, and it has nothing to do with how important they are. It's all about the size of their books. And so Daniel is in there. Why are we looking at Daniel? The book of Daniel is part of the genre of biblical literature that we call exilic literature, meaning from the exile. And so Daniel goes along with Esther, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and then parts of a few of the different minor prophets. But together they talk about the time when Israel was carried off into exile by the Babylonian Empire. So after slavery in Egypt, that whole Moses and let my people go story, after that, this is the next biggest national tragedy that really shaped the nation of Israel. And if you don't think national tragedies shape you, we just had our 9/11 memorial, right? I'm going to the airport in the morning. Used to could be, I could park on the curb and walk right in, and that's all gone, right? Things change. Same thing is true for the Israelites on a much bigger scale. So you might look at the Exodus and the exile as being the two things that most marked Israel in somewhat negative capacity in the whole of the Old Testament literature. And so instead of the Pharaoh of the Exodus story, the bad guy in this story is King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He invaded Israel, carried the people off into exile, away from Israel, where the government, the schools, the arts, the culture had all been biblically based, faith-based from the God of the Bible, taken off into a city and a culture in which all those things were hostile to the God of the Bible. And so the question came up for those exiled Jews, all right, how do I live as a person of faith in a non-believing world? How do I be a believer in a non-believing world? How can I have a spiritual life in a secular society where all the cultural elements are actually hostile to my faith and to the God that I believe in? And so that is the big question. And therefore, I think Daniel is actually very relevant to our life today. There was a time several years ago in America and in Europe where basically the big cultural dynamics, government, arts, most higher education was very supportive of Christianity, either informally or perhaps even officially supportive. But that's not true anymore. I can tell you, having been just in Europe this summer, there's so many big churches that are now restaurants and museums and scuba shops and all those kinds of things. And so we have those dynamics in America as well. And so on one level, we're all of us kind of like Daniel. We as believers are living our life and asking the question, how do we live a life of faith in a polytheistic, pluralistic, unbelieving world? And so some of us are in that boat. Maybe you're here and you're not a Christian yet. And your question is, why would I want to become a Christian when I have all these other options available to me? And Daniel answers those questions as well. Daniel in exile, for the first time in his life, had spiritual options. Growing up as a Jewish kid in Israel, there was just the one show in town. And so now he's got options. So whether you're coming from a perspective of faith or coming from more of a seeker perspective, I think Daniel has a lot to say to us as we ask these questions. I think we're going to learn some principles for living from this that will be very applicable to where we are today in our postmodern, really post-Christian culture. This is, of course, especially relevant to where we live in Austin. I don't know if you've noticed, but Austin is not exactly the buckle of the Bible Belt, right? Now, my out-of-state friends don't get this, right? Outsiders don't get this. I got church planter friends around the country, and they always protest, but you're in Texas. I've been to Dallas. I've been to Houston. There's giant churches everywhere. Yes, And we may be 3 hours from Dallas, but we are light years away in culture. It's just a different dynamic. If you're in Austin, have you ever heard the saying, if you're going to move north of the river, you might as well move to Dallas? You ever hear that? That's a South Austin saying. What that means is the further north you go, the more conservative, the more traditional the values become, and that translates into more Christian belief and greater church attendance. Most of the larger churches we have in Austin tend to be further to the north. A few years ago, I was meeting with a group of church planters. We would get together in the area quarterly and just encourage one another and bring in guest speakers. And the speaker we brought in this time was the Austin City demographer. His job was to look through all the statistics and the things and kind of project what the future of Austin was going to be. Fun job, right? Fascinating guy. And he told us all these interesting things. I remember he was saying that, I don't know if you know this, historically, Austin doubles in population every 20 years. Think of that, every 20 years. The highways don't double, but the people double every 20 years, and we're right on pace for that again. Now, this city futurist, he also happened to be a Christian. So during the Q&A time, one of my friends asked him a question. They said, how often, when you're in city meetings or city planning or these kind of things, how often does the faith community get brought up? Like, hey, we should see what the pastors think about this, or maybe we should get the faith leaders to help us implement this dynamic, you know, and how often does the faith community get brought up? And you know what he said? Never. Zero. He said, in fact, the faith community had zero visibility in the local government stage. And he said, you know, for him, it was kind of strange because he had moved here from doing this job a few years back in Atlanta. And he said, now when I moved to Atlanta, one of the first questions everybody asked me was, have you found a church yet? Right? It was like, you found the barber, you know, you found the good restaurants, you know, you got your kids, where the kids are going to school, you found a church yet? And he had been there, I think, he'd been here 6 years at that point. And he said those 6 years, he had not been asked that question one single time in Austin. It just wasn't, he said. The reality is church is not really a part of the social fabric of this city. Those of us who do hold a Christian worldview make up a minority in our city, which is why many Christians have moved out to the suburbs, right? Come on, I won't name names, but you've heard those conversations, right, about neighboring counties, maybe neighboring school districts. That might be why some of you live out there. Now, I know a big reason might be economics. This is a very expensive city to live in. But the reality is nobody is mistaking Austin for the live Christian capital of the world. Right? This is not where we are. So when it comes to believing exiles learning to live in an unbelieving city, I think the book of Daniel has a lot to teach us. And so what I want to do today is start off by coming to understand a little bit about who Daniel was, and even more specifically, what it was that made him that way. He's a unique character in all the Bible, and what crafted him was very unique. So next week, we are going to see an interaction that Daniel had with King Nebuchadnezzar himself. He gets a chance to go, you know, speak truth to power with the head honcho, and it involved a very disturbing dream that the king had. In fact, this dream, very famous. It's been interpreted in a million different ways. You know, if you grew up in certain churches, you probably heard that it meant that Russia was the big end time monster, was going to lead to the Antichrist, all this kind of stuff. It gets interpreted all throughout history. That's next week. This week, we're just going to cover one verse of that story. All right, just one verse. So, in Daniel chapter 2, verse 26, we read this. The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it? Now, how do we get a sermon out of that? Well, I would suggest to you that there is a whole lot more packed into this one little seemingly innocuous sentence that might be first readily visible to us. So we'll talk about the dream next week, but for today, I want to talk about why does Daniel have two names? What's the deal with that? Two names. One, Daniel, is what we know him by. That's a Hebrew name. It's the Hebrew word for God is my judge. El, meaning God, and Daniel, it's to judge. So God is my judge. And then Belteshazzar, which is a Babylonian word that means Baal is my God. You ever heard of Baal? You ever heard of Beelzebub? That's the Lord of the Flies, Beelzebub. Well, Baal was a Babylonian god. They had many gods. And Baal in particular was the god of fertility, which meant that there was an awful lot of sexual promiscuity that went along with Baal worship. Another link to our Austin culture, perhaps. But the question here is, why would this good Israelite, what is a good Israelite young man who believes in the God of Israel, what's he doing with this Babylonian name? And it really is quite strange, but when you dig deep down, I think it's pretty profound as well. Now, before we jump into his story in particular, we need to do a little bit of background work that's really going to set us up for the whole series in general. So how did Daniel get here in the first place, okay? Well, this story is taking place roughly 600 years before Jesus came onto the scene, right? The ground zero in history, right? BC, AD, or is it AC now? What's the politically correct name? But you got this marker, and so this is 600 years before. 586 BC is generally considered the beginning of the Great Exile, when the Babylonians' army marched into Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, tore its walls down, tore its temple down, didn't leave one stone on top of the other, and carried the population off to live in a foreign land for 50 years. Okay? But 18 years before that, so 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar had invaded Israel the first time and carried off not the whole population, but just 10,000 people out of that population. But who are these 10,000? First chapter of Daniel describes the kind of people he took. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Okay, this is the upper class. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. All right, these are the swipe right guys. Is that it? Swipe right? Swipe left? These are the, right? He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. Now, this is, get who these are. These are the cream of the crop from the best families in Israel. The idea being what? Because they're saying, hey, Israel, you guys better behave, because I got your favorite sons over here with me, right? So settle down. Well, of course, we know through history, Israel didn't behave. And so Nebuchadnezzar marched back in 18 years later and carted everybody else off too. But it was actually a brilliant plan on Nebuchadnezzar's part. How do you make a conquered nation subject to the Babylonian will? How do you make them assimilate to empire? We know, anybody that's smart knows, persecution doesn't really work, right? You put your foot on their neck and you kill them, and what you do is you raise up martyrs. And then you've got ideological, freedom fighters or terrorists, depending on which side you're on. They're going to fight back. That's not necessarily the best way. And so Nebuchadnezzar's way was very simple. What you do is you take the leaders of their culture and you get them to conform to the elements of your culture. See, you Babylonize them. Babylon had a polytheistic culture, the belief in multiple gods. Israel had a monotheistic culture, just one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. See, and the plan was to destroy the biblical worldview of the whole professional class of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar would take the elite off to live in his city, and they would become intellectually and socially and spiritually and culturally Babylonian. And then what? Through their influence, they would spread to everybody else. And that is a brilliant plan. Okay? And so that's what he did. He didn't get to be the ruler of the known world for nothing. So what happened was he brings this initial group in, and when these exiles got to Babylon, the first thing they did is they began to settle down outside the city. Okay? They settled across the river outside the city, and like immigrants have done, since the history of the world, they formed together in kind of tight-knit little ghetto communities to seek to retain their own cultural identity. Right? And so here they are all together in this Hebrew enclave, and they begin to have spiritual needs. They didn't have priests there. The temple was gone. There's no priests. So these prophets would pop up to begin to deal with the spiritual needs of the people and to communicate with them on God's behalf. And if you want to know what these prophets said, you go to another book. You go to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 28, and the leading prophet was a man named Hananiah. Jeremiah 28 gives us his prophecy. I won't read it for you, but I'll give you the summary of what he said. What he said was basically this: don't move into the city. Okay? We're believers. They're not. You got no business in that wicked pagan city. So just stay out of Babylon and pray against the city. Okay? Pray against the city, and we prophets see that what God is going to do is he's going to judge that city, and we are going to come out on top. In fact, he said specifically within 2 years, I'm telling you, God is going to end our captivity, and he's going to turn everything around. And we're going to be the bosses. We're going to have the chain on their necks, and we're going to be in power, and we're going to be back in charge, and we're going to have the cultural influence. Okay? So pray against the city and avoid it in any way you can. All right? Now that is the prophecy of Hananiah. Only problem is this: the Bible calls Hananiah a false prophet. In fact, if you go to Jeremiah chapter 28, you look at the head, it says, the false prophet Hananiah. See? And so when the true prophet, when Jeremiah, okay, still back in Israel, when he got wind of what his cronies were telling the Israelites, he's in prayer and he's going, that's not what God's saying. Nah, that's not it at all. So he sits down and he writes them a letter that contains the revealed will of God for these exiles in Babylon. And it became the blueprint for Daniel's life. Okay, that's why I am going to read you this. All right? I won't read you the falsehood, but this is what Jeremiah said. Jeremiah chapter 29. Okay, this is his rebuttal to 28. This is what the Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I have carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Oh, wait a minute. Is Nebuchadnezzar writing this letter? I've carried him off. That'll come back. God says, build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and the diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. By the way, why were they prophesying this? Because the people are like, give us some good news. Sometimes a preacher wants to be popular. Don't listen to them. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Now, this must have been absolutely astounding to the people who were listening to this, because this seems counterintuitive to everything you might think that God would say. In fact, some of you might go, wait a minute, if you just read me Hananiah, I would assume that was that sounds like Bible. It sounds like what I grew up hearing. That's what my preacher said. That's what these kind of dynamics. But that's not what God's saying. And specifically, God is saying three things here that must have absolutely astonished these people. And the first thing is this. He's saying, get a bigger picture about what I'm doing. All right? That is, to the city which I have carried you to. Right? Did you catch that? He says, to all those I carried into exile. What's God saying? God is saying, you know what? It's part of my plan that you lost cultural power. It's part of my plan that you believers now have to live in a pagan, wicked city. Part of my plan. My plan to change and renew you. My plan to change and renew them. It's part of my plan to get my word out into the larger world. Your loss of cultural power. Okay? You're having to live as believers in an unbelieving world. It's all part of my plan. Okay? So in light of that, God says, you move in there. Get in the city. Don't stay away. So that's the first thing. Second thing God says is, I refuse to let you believe that the only choices that you've got are assimilation or separation. See? The false prophets are saying, stay out, or else if you get in there, you're going to lose your identity. See? Separate, or else you'll assimilate. But God is saying, that's not the only two choices. Now listen, on the one hand, God is saying, don't assimilate, right? Don't lose your identity. Remember, it says increase in number there. Don't decrease. See, that means don't lose your identity. Don't just melt in and become Babylonians. Know who you are. Increase the number of believers. Stay in a covenant relationship with me. So on the one hand, no, don't just assimilate and lose your identity. But on the other hand, what? Build houses, plant gardens, settle down. You don't plant a garden in a rent house you're going to be in for a year. He's saying settle in for the long haul. See? Seek the prosperity of the city. So this is what God's saying. I don't want you to assimilate, but on the other hand, I want you to move in. I want you to put down roots. I want you to be deeply involved in the life of the city. Economically, culturally, I want you to raise your families here. I want you to be deeply engaged in the life of the city. So I don't want you to assimilate, but I also don't want you to separate. I want you to be deeply engaged in the life of the city, but living distinctly as my people, as holding on to your biblical worldview. See, what God is calling his people to be is bicultural. Every missionary, we prayed for our missionary of the week today. They're moving into a new culture. They've got to be bicultural. They've got to go in and they got to love where God's called them to be, but they got to be, you know, who they are too, and find that delicate balance. Well, God says, this is what I'm calling each and every one of you to do. I want you to move into the wicked city of man, but I want you to stay citizens of the city of God. I don't want you to love me and hate the city, but I also don't want you to love the city and forget about me. I want you to love both, see? And that leads us to a third thing. So he says, first, I want you to see this is all part of my plan, right? Second, I don't want you to assimilate or separate, but then, third, I want you to engage with the city. Well, all right, how? How can you do that? And here's what God says. Pray for that city, right? Seek the peace of that city, because if the city prospers, you're going to prosper too, see? And this is the key to the motivation. It's that word peace. Seek the peace of the city. The word peace in Hebrew is the word shalom. Okay? Shalom, a very important word, has a lot of meanings. One is it's used as a greeting, right? Shalom. Well, do you remember several years ago there was a fad, you guys probably remember this. This is a t-shirt. This is a black t-shirt with white letters. Say hello on the front and goodbye on the back. Do you remember these? And they would have something like hola and adios. You had just different ones. I saw one once and it said shalom on the front and shalom on the back. It's very clever because in Hebrew that is, you know, hello, goodbye. That's a greeting and a farewell. But it doesn't, it means more than that. It means, the word shalom in the Bible means complete well-being, okay, total well-being. It's the world as God created it to be. Shalom is Eden before the fall. It means spiritual well-being, physical well-being, economic well-being, relational well-being. It's the way things were meant to be. It's paradise. Whenever you see some tragedy or some injustice and you go, man, that's just not right. That's not the way it's supposed to be. Have you ever seen a funeral where a parent's burying their kid and you just go, that's not the way it's supposed to be? What that is your heart crying out for shalom. You're experiencing the absence of shalom, the world the way it was meant to be. And so what God is saying is, listen, I don't want you to just go in there and build your little churches in the city and shake your finger at everything that's happening around you. No, he's saying, I want you to put your lives on the line to go in and to make that a great place. I want you to make it a safe place. I want you to make it a prosperous place, not just for some, but for everybody. You know, I want you to spread your faith, yes, but I also want you to help the people in need. See, I want you to do everything you can out of love for the city. Pray for the city. See, the prophets were saying, false prophets, pray against the city, so it'll be judged and we'll be back in power. The true prophet, God himself, says, no. No, listen, if you go into the city, on the one hand, if you go into the city just celebrating and you don't see how broken it is, okay, that you're not really seeking its peace. If you go in and, oh, you know, Austin, we're just so rich and I love all of our festivals, and you walk by and ignore the homeless population like everybody else is, that's not seeking the peace of the city. You're not admitting how needy it is. But if you go in just to despise it, I've been around, I came to Austin first in 1990. There were a lot of churches back then that was their whole mentality, was like, oh, you know, the city's wicked. And those churches are all dead and dying today if they're around at all. They were against the city. God says, no, 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 no. You don't want that. He says, you got to go in and love the city. Love the city of man for the sake of the city of God. He says, live in both. Have two names. Okay, have two names. But again, most Christians don't get this. Most Christians live either lives of assimilation or lives of separation. But not Daniel. Okay, Daniel was different. And this is the blueprint. Daniel was either there and heard Jeremiah's letter being read, or his parents read it to him later. We don't exactly know how old Daniel was during the exile. But this is the blueprint. Look at it carefully. Who is this guy? We know Daniel is functionally a prophet himself. The whole second half of his book that we won't get to in this series, it's all end times prophecy stuff to mirror Revelation. It's dragons and visions and all this kind of mystery stuff. He says all kinds of powerful things about God. He's completely monotheistic. Okay, we're going to see him lay his life on the line for God in a future story. He's utterly committed to the exclusive sovereign God of the Bible. In fact, Daniel is one of the few characters in the Bible that I can't find a single flaw in. Maybe the only one. There are, you look at people like Abraham and Moses and David, powerful men of God, but deeply flawed, right? And you see that all throughout the Bible. But Daniel is a bright and shining exception. He's the real deal. Okay? But how did he get his job? Why is he here having a one-on-one audience with the king? You read about it in chapter 1. He's in civil service. See, Daniel's in the government. The wise men were the people that ran things in the community, and Daniel was one of them. And guess what? He had to go through a very rigorous liberal arts education in Babylonian culture to become one of them. In fact, let me show you something that's probably going to make some of your skin crawl. And I don't know any way around it. But Daniel chapter 2, verse 27, it says this, Daniel replied, he's talking to the king, no wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he's asked about. You know what he's saying? That's what Daniel is. See, these magi who are running the country, they are the king's cabinet, and in order for Daniel to be where he is, he had to study enchanting, magic, divination, right? He had to study all of the Babylonian culture, including all that occult stuff. Now, there are a lot of Christians today who would say, mustn't touch any of that, right? Mustn't be contaminated, mustn't be polluted by any of those kinds of things. Students, you shouldn't take certain classes. But what do you do with Daniel? Daniel is a believer who mastered that pagan material and yet still kept a distinctly biblical worldview. And therefore, he was living and working at the highest levels of pagan government and culture, and yet doing it as a distinct follower of the God of the Bible. How could he do that? Why can't we do that? Because the blueprint of his life was Jeremiah 29, and the rest of us are locked into either assimilation or separation. Now, this isn't easy, okay? Of course it's not easy. And here's one of the reasons why. Let's take a real practical application for a profession today. And I thought about this. I could have used a lawyer, a businessman or woman, a politician was kind of low-hanging fruit. So many things. But let's pretend that a student at the University of Texas, and we've got a number of Longhorn students with us this morning. Hook 'em. Let's assume one of you guys is studying to be an actor. Okay? You're in the drama. Are you really? Very cool. You're at the drama school. I'm going to use you as an example. And so you're getting ready to move out to Hollywood or New York or whatever you're going to do, and you're going to go be an actor. But maybe you come to me. We just met today, so I don't know you, but you come and say, hey, Pastor, before I go, I've got a question for you. I want to talk this through. Listen, what kind of role should I take? Okay? As a Christian, are there roles I shouldn't take? Are there some roles maybe I should hold my nose and do it anyway? Are there some things I shouldn't do under any conditions? So, and what are they? Now, listen, if you go out to LA, if you go out to Hollywood and you never ask that question, you never say, how does my faith, how does the cross, how does the resurrection, how does the gospel, right? How do the salvation elements in my life, how do they apply to my acting? If you never wrestle with that, if you never ask that question, say you've assimilated. You've just moved there and decreased, as Jeremiah writes. You've lost yourself. Now, don't do that. It's very interesting. Brad Pitt's brother and sister, in fact, his mom and dad for a little while, they attended the church that I served back in Missouri. And it was funny because his brother Doug, we sat on some committees together, and I'd be talking and look over and go, it's Brad Pitt, because he looks just like him. But anyway, interesting story. Brad grew up in that city. Brad was actually the first Christian in his family. When he was a youth, he went to some services and got in there, and he wound up getting the rest of his family into church. But then he went off into Hollywood and had a crisis of faith and kind of abandoned all that. So he assimilated. So don't do that. On the other hand, though, if you come to me and say, all right, well, Pastor, what are the rules? I need you to spell out for me how many of a certain word can I say and still be in a, you know what I'm saying? Is it okay for me to kiss a woman who's not my wife as long as she's portraying my wife in the show, you know? How much of my butt can I show for artistic purposes, you know? Jesus said, turn the other cheek. What was that? Was that, you know? Which book of the Bible spells out the rules for Christian actors? Well, there's not one. There's also not a book for Christian business people, or a book for Christian politicians, or a book for Christian scientists. Okay? Not the sect, actual scientists who are Christians. And there's a ton of them, actually. Why no books? Because there's actually very few rules. There's a few basic rules. There's the 10 Commandments. Don't lie, don't steal, don't have sex outside of marriage, be generous with your money. But honestly, some of the best ways that we learn those lessons is by seeing the consequences of people who don't follow them. You know, it's an old known fact. You can learn virtues by watching a villain. Shakespeare knew that. The Greek tragedies knew that. Charles Dickens knows that. We all know that. There are some roles that are moral, not in the actions that the character does, but in the results that those actions bring. Right? Now, if a character is evil to show, look how great evil is, and always gets away with it, well, that's an immoral dynamic. But if they're evil and eventually you're like, the crime doesn't pay. See what I'm saying? And so if you say, well, I'm a Christian, so I'll never portray an adulterer. Well, these are your choices, but you're going to have to pass on the script for King David, the movie, when it comes along. You know, it's just not that black and white. Portraying sin is not automatically the same thing as celebrating sin. Okay, but here's the dilemma. If you don't ask the question, right, what role should I take? Or if you're an attorney, what clients do I take? If you're a businessman, what accounts do I represent? Well, then if you don't even ask the question, you're an assimilator. But if you insist there's got to be rules, or you despair over the lack of rules, or it's got to be black and white, then you're a separationist. See, you don't want the hard work of thinking that stuff out in community, because you got to do that with one another. You got to let the Holy Spirit lead you in that. It gets tricky. You could be dancing through a minefield, and that's uncomfortable. By the way, let me go back to Brad Pitt for just a minute, lest we disparage him completely as a reprobate. I think it's important to understand something. I want you to hear a quote I read in People magazine a few years ago. I don't really read People magazine, but it caught me of interest. I think it explains a lot. He's talking about his faith. Listen to this. He says this about growing up. I'd go to Christian revivals and be moved by the Holy Spirit, and I'd go to rock concerts and feel the same fervor. Then I'd be told, that's the devil's music, don't partake in it. So I wanted to experience these things religion said not to experience. I wonder how many of our kids go off to college and swing to this extreme of assimilation because they're reacting against the extreme of separation that they've been hearing all the time growing up in church. We blame secular colleges for the drop-off in faith that happens in 18 to 22-year-olds. But how much responsibility of that rests on the church? Are we preparing our young people to know what they believe and why they believe it? And are we preparing them to go into the world and live this way? See, you got one side shouting assimilate, and the other side shouting separate. But God calls us instead to be a Daniel. be a Daniel. Now, I grew up in Sunday school. I was a Sunday school kid, and we talked about Daniel a lot. I remember the lion's den story and all that from the time I was a little kid. In fact, we had a song, this old school, like flannel graph level, if you remember what that was, Bible stories. And it was called Dare to be a Daniel. Has anybody ever heard Dare to be a Daniel? You're about to. Play this clip here, just a little. Feel free to sing along. Dare to stand alone. Dare to do. All right, you're going to have that stuck in your head the rest of the day, by the way, so you're welcome. But here's the funny thing about that. I always heard Dare to be a Daniel. But you know what? My Sunday school teacher never told me what it meant to be a Daniel. I never had a Sunday school teacher say, now, by the way, boys and girls, what this is teaching us is that God needs Christians to get into governmental structures, entertainment structures, educational structures, journalism structures. You need to rise to the heights of the pagan culture that you can. Your goal should be not to write for Christianity Today. Your goal should be to write for the New York Times. You need to master the pagan learning. You need to master being a non-believer living being a believer living in a non-believing world. You need to master that non-believing literature and their worldview. Live and work in the city, but do it as a distinctive Christian. They never said that. Why? Because most churches are saying what Hananiah said, not what Jeremiah said. Most churches say stay away, move out of the city, take your kids out of those schools, establish your own culture. And listen, they mean well. They mean well. But that is not actually the biblical worldview. And in the end, it doesn't advance the kingdom of God in the world. It just creates a little sub-Christian ghetto over here to the side, like some after-school club. I'll give you an example from the life of our church. Last week was our 15th anniversary as a congregation, and so I was looking through some old pictures and things, and it brought back a lot of memories, and I came across one of them that it brought this to mind. I hadn't seen these guys in a while, but show this picture. This is our worship band from the movie theater days. We met at the AMC Theater at Barton Creek Mall for 6 years, and so this picture is probably circa 2006, I would guess. And the three guys in the back, the bass player, drums, and lead guitar, they were the core of the worship band for several years, and they had their own band called the Professional Americans. They cut an EP or two, played gigs all over Austin. Actually, during the mixer, I was playing an old Professional American song, so you'll hear the Pro-Am on the way out the door. I'll play them again. Now, here's the thing. I've known these guys since they were teenagers, maybe before that, late elementary, since they were little kids. Know their parents are friends of mine, and back in Missouri, their band, they made up the core of the youth group worship band in that church back in Missouri. Now, this was a youth group that ran on average on a given week, they would run 600 to 700 kids in youth group. That's a youth group that's twice the size of our church all put together, all right? So these guys were leading them in worship every week. It's a big deal. At the same time, outside of church, they had formed their own band. It started off this, in mom and dad's basement kind of thing, but they were starting to take the local college scene by storm. And I'd go see them play in coffee shops and, let's call a spade, in bars, So I'm in there. They'd be like, who's the old guy in the corner? I think the cops are here, Actually, I might have been barely 30 then, but I would go and hear these guys, and they were really good, and they were starting to get some record label attention and everything. But they really saw this band as a ministry, not just in church, but they were building relationships in the music community, just living out their faith in a pretty secular place. And then one day, the leadership of the church youth group came to them and said, guys, you got to make a choice. So we can't have you playing in bars on Saturday nights and playing in church on Sunday morning. See, you got to separate. And it was a huge dilemma. And listen, it would have been different if these guys were playing in bars just to chase skirts and have a good time. They weren't. I knew them. I knew their hearts. They saw the band as God's call for them to spread the gospel into some hard places in the world. And now they were being asked to give that up. And listen, the leaders of that youth group, they were and are still good friends of mine. They were good people doing good work. They just got caught up in this difficult dilemma that so many churches do. Separate. See? If the lines look blurry, Just separate. But Jeremiah said, no, God is calling you to get in there. God is sending you into the city for the prosperity of the city. The city needs Christians. The city needs followers of Christ who will serve and minister and be his hands and his feet in the community. And so they were making this decision and they were wrestling. And so one night I went to meet with them after a show in a coffee shop, and we were all sitting around. And I said, listen, hey guys, let me just throw something out there. But some of us are getting ready to leave and move to Austin, and we're going to go create this church in exile, down there, kind of a Daniel church. And not only would we let you play in bars, we'd want you to. And beyond that, we'd be your covering in that. We'd get involved. We'd ask you the hard questions because, there's all kinds of temptations that go into that, and make sure, that you're standing up for all kind of things. We'd be there for you. And I'll never forget that conversation. Why don't you come down and help us, live in this pagan city and do our thing. And, it was, we were sitting at this table, and just happened to be up on the wall next to us this giant poster of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I was like, are you kidding? In Springfield, Missouri, this is, the symbol of Austin right here. This is God's sign that you're supposed to come to Austin. And anyway, in time, they did just that. And they moved to Austin, and they served our church faithfully for a dozen years, or half a dozen years. Now, eventually they grew up. They started getting married and having kids and having jobs and needing to make money, and some of them moved off, and the band gig kind of fell apart. That's a hard business. But while it lasted, they were making an impact for God at Southwest Family Fellowship, and at South by Southwest, and at Antone's, and at Emo's, and at Mohawks. And I saw lives transformed through their witness. See, what they were doing was they were being a Daniel. God called them. See, like God called me, like God called you to this city for the sake of this city. But, listen, God also said, you know what? I have carried you to the city also for your sake. Can I tell you? I have spiritually needed this city every bit as much, if not more, than this city has hopefully needed me. I came back to Austin 15 years ago, and I hope I've made some contribution to this city. But I want you to know I've gotten a whole lot more out of Austin than I've ever put in. And that's not hyperbole. It is important for Christians to go into places where Christians are out of power. It is important for Christians to have a good number of friends who are non-Christians. I hope you do. If not, you've separated even in the heart of Austin culture. You need their perspective. See, when I came here, I had a lot of pat answers about why people weren't Christians. And then when I started actually hanging around people that weren't Christians, I realized how stupid many of my answers were, my thoughts. I said, you know what? A lot of these people that don't believe, I found out they have some pretty good reasons for not believing. It's good to be in those environments. I will tell you, I have found raising my children in this city to be one of the best things I've ever done. Absolutely. As opposed to raising them in some separate Christian enclave somewhere. Have we had some talks that we might not have had in other environments? Yes, we have. And maybe a few years earlier than we've had, sure. But I'm grateful for that. I wouldn't trade a thing. See, we need the city. The city humbles us. It refines us. It forces us to focus on what we really believe. Can I tell you guys, I grew more in my faith during my years at the University of Texas than I probably ever have in my whole life. Because before then, my faith could be my parents' faith. This is what I got. No, but in that pressure cooker, I had to really know what I believed and why I believed it. It had to become my faith. See, it's good for Christians to have the perspective of outsiders. Christians need to be taken out of power. Christianity is a religion of the cross, and the cross, by definition, is a power under game. Jesus says, I'm going to save the world by laying down my life for them. But what happens when Christians get into power? We begin to play what everybody else plays, which is the power over game. And I'm going to save the world by powering over others. And that never works. You cannot fight God's war with the enemy's weapons. And what happens is, as soon as Christians get in power for long, they go to seed. And if you think I'm being political today, I'm talking as a church historian. I'm talking about 2,000 years of church history. It always, always works out that way. And so every so often, the way that God revives us, the way that God gets his true religion to come back to the surface, the way that God peels away all the gunk of religion and gets the gospel to come back to the surface, is he takes us out of power and he puts us in the city to humble us. The city that needs us, yes, but the city that we need as well. And so that's the first principle from the life of Daniel. Love the city. Be engaged in the city. Don't assimilate. Anybody good, but don't separate. Have two names. And listen, you know who is really good at that? Jesus Christ. Right? He lived this stuff out. You know what? He was the fulfillment of this lifestyle. He had two names. He was fully God, 100% divine. And at the same time, he was flesh and blood human being. He was the real Son of God, but he was also a real human being. And Jesus lived his life for our example. You know, he would not separate the way the religious leaders of his day wanted him to, but he also wouldn't assimilate the way the empirical leaders of his day wanted him to as well. He lived out the life of the ultimate David. And it cost him, right? Cost him his life. But through his sacrifice, he changed the world. See, and guess what? Did you know he prayed the same thing for you and me? Listen to his prayer for us on the night he was betrayed. This is, you can know somebody's heart. When you get stressed out, you get self-focused. Today is my wife's birthday. And I didn't say happy birthday for about the first 10 minutes that we were awake together this morning. I felt, because why? I was laying down my life for you guys. I was so focused on my work, right? When you get stressed and you get focused, you lose sight of people around you. Jesus didn't do that. Look, he's in the height of his stress. The Last Supper is over. It's the middle of the night. He's in the garden talking to his Father about what's coming. But look what he stops to see. See if you can see the blueprint in this. This is John 17. Jesus says, Father, I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. But just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. And I give myself as a holy sacrifice for them so that they can be made holy by your truth. That's his prayer for you. See? To be in the world, but not be of the world. Be a Daniel. See? And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to walk through and we're going to see how to do that. We're going to see from these stories from his life. And listen, I wish I could tell you it's easy, but it isn't easy. But I can tell you it's your calling. And the one who spoke through the prophet Jeremiah, and the one who spoke through the prophet Daniel, and the one who prayed this prayer, Jesus Christ, he will give you the strength and the courage, and maybe most of all, the wisdom that you need to live in this balance. Be a Daniel. Pray for you. Father God, first of all, just say that I love this city. Thank you for Austin. I know there's too many times as churches, as church leaders, as Christians, plenty of things we can criticize. Plenty of things we can moan about. But God, I love this city first and foremost because you love this city. Most famous verse in all the world says, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Not just loved Christians in the world, loved the world. Loved every city, not just American cities either. Every city in this world, people that have not yet heard the gospel, that don't know about the love of God, and he has sent us as his representatives in to show the love of the gospel. And Father God, that means that we've got to get involved. We got to help out with the physical needs of our city. We got to help out with the health care. There's some people in here that are nurses and doctors and physicians, and that's great. They need to know you've called them to do that. Every one of us in the profession that you've given us, you've called us to here. The best thing that a Christian educator can do is not figure out how to squeeze the Bible covertly into their curriculum. It's to be the best educator they could be, to educate these kids to the highest levels that they possibly can, because that raises everybody up and that makes the city better. And they're motivated to do it not by the perks and not by just the salaries, not by the accolades, but they're motivated to do it because Jesus Christ said, love this city, love the children of this city, pour into their lives. So God, wherever we are, whatever we're doing, I pray that each and every one of us would look at our role in new light this week. Whatever we do, we look at it and say, Holy Spirit, would you show me how what I do can make a difference for your kingdom? And Father, yes, sometimes it is as straightforward as inviting somebody to church that doesn't believe in you or sharing our faith with somebody that doesn't believe in you. Absolutely, that's a piece of it. But it's not the foundation of it. The foundation of it is in the world, in the city of man, for the sake of the city of God. To do our part, God, to begin to bring a little glimpse of shalom, a little glimpse of paradise, a little glimpse of heaven to the people that are living out hell on this earth now. We can do that in so many different ways, God, but we can't do it from a distance. A doctor risks getting infection because they got to get close. But God, that's what you did through Jesus Christ. Thank you, Jesus, for living out that example and for helping us to know that even if we lay down everything, you're going to resurrect what's been lost. Until one day, your kingdom truly comes on earth as it is in heaven. And we long for that day. But we don't sit back and bury our heads in the sand and wish and dream. We roll up our sleeves. We get our education. We get busy for the sake of the people that you love, for the sake of the call that you've given, for the sake of the love of your Son, Jesus Christ. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.